Hi, everybody, or not quite everybody. I'll wait a few more minutes for everybody. It's good to see you. Just going to wait another 15 seconds or so. Okay. A great conversation on Monday that I'm hoping we can revisit some of those points about narrative, the invention of the narrator through her own voice. But before we do that, there's a couple of concepts that I want us to be familiar with and to have a handle on. And then I'm going to go back and do a whole bunch of quoting from the novel so that we have a clearer sense of what kind of character Lucy Snow is, how she represents herself. I want to talk a little bit about her engagement with Gothic conventions, which is not necessarily something that you would have thought about when you first read this novel. And then, time permitting, move into a discussion about John Graham and Polly and some of the other characters in the novel. But before that, I'm going to do a screen share. By the way, once again, I do welcome you to interrupt me at any point by unmuting yourself and throwing questions and comments out. But in the meantime, there's this. Can everyone see that? Okay. Once again, those of you who studied with me before know that I use the concept of focalization, and I think it's one that it would benefit all of us to have some sort of grasp on this year, especially when we're talking about the ways in which novels focus their vision through the eyes of certain characters or voices. So please interrupt me at any point if I'm being unclear. I'm going to be unclear here. I'm going to work my way into a definition. Why do I prefer to talk about focalization right over point of view or perspective? Because all three of those things seem to be identical, but there's a slight difference. And I'm going to try to explain that to you. I'm happy for you to talk about narrative point of view in your writing and to avoid focalization as a concept. I'm also happy for you to write about a text's perspective on things instead of talking about focalization. But what the concept of focalization does is it enables us to talk about things like point of view or voice or perspective, all as part of a bigger package. And so I'm quoting here, and I can't even remember where I stole this from. So by the way, this is a moment of plagiarism here on my part. These are quotations from a text, and I can't remember where I got it from. I'll have to find that information for you. I think it's from Mika Ball in her text on narratology. Focalization is a term that emerged from a school of study called narratology that investigates the literary techniques that novelists and short story writers and essayists and so on employ to produce what we would call a certain kind of identifiable voice or point of view. So here's what this person says about focalization. I'm gonna try to unpack this a bit for you. Whenever events are presented, let's say in a novel, they are always presented from within a certain vision. Now that vision may be the author's vision, We may talk about that vision as being the text's vision, but we can also talk about that vision as being one that is filtered through a character or a whole series of characters in that novel. The vision of the text that is taken in relation to the events that unfold in that text is something that can come from a multitude of what we might call positions or perspectives. What focalization allows us to do is to speculate on the overall vision of a text, as opposed to something more limited like a simple point of view. Now, I know that that's not an easy concept to grasp, so let me just try to get a bit further along here. A point of view is chosen by every text, a certain way of seeing things. I'm going to highlight this actually, I quite like this, a way of seeing things, a certain angle, whether real historical facts are concerned or fictitious events. So this isn't just something that occurs in a novel. It might occur in a piece of reportage from a newspaper or in an editorial or in an essay. There's always an implied point of view. And our job as developing literary scholars is to tease out what that vision is that serves as a set of kind of presuppositions to how the text presents its story. Okay, I shall refer to the relations between the elements of the story presented. We can call those plot elements or major themes or events that unfold in a novel. So the relations between the elements presented and the vision through which they are presented with the term focalization. Focalization is then the relation between the vision and that which is perceived. The relation between the vision and that which is seen, perceived. Most of Villette is focalized through Lucy Snow as the first person narrator. Her vision of the world, and that's what I'm going to get to in just a couple of minutes, how she perceives the world and what she has to say about it, is, however, simply one of numerous perspectives in the novel, but we might call it the primary or the chief perspective. The world that we see in Villette is the world focalized through the vision of Lucy Snow. Okay, and what we need to do as critical readers of the novel is attempt to step outside of Lucy Snow's way of viewing the world to ask ourselves, how is it that she positions herself in relation to that world? Is her vision, we talked a little bit on Monday about whether or not Lucy is a reliable narrator, and I queried what exactly that meant, but is her vision reliable? Is she representing the world as it really exists, or is she creating that world through her focalization of it? You see what I'm saying? Okay, so the concept of focalization distinguishes between the vision through which the elements are presented and the identity of the voice that is verbalizing that vision. That's kind of a complicated idea to get our heads around, and I'm not completely straight on this myself. But let me say this about that final observation. We, as critical readers, and I don't mean negative readers, I hope you all loved Villette. I loved the novel, even if I don't always love Lucy Snow. But the distinction between loving the novel or loving the vision or appreciating the vision and not liking the narrator is precisely the kind of ironic distance that we take up in relation to Lucy Snow. We are able to distance ourselves from her by recognizing that she herself is rather limited in the way she perceives the world and represents it. That is deliberate, that limitation. I don't think we're supposed to admire Lucy Snow unambiguously. I think she's an ambiguous and an ambivalent character. she's built like that. Parts of her are deeply unlikable, right? That said, she presents a vision of the world, but her voice, the voice she uses to represent that vision of the world, is distinct from the actual vision. Okay. Let me see if we can go further with this simply by turning to the novel. Okay, I'm going to leave this up for just a couple of minutes. And then I'm going to stop screen share and then I'll come back to screen share. But focalization, primarily the vision of the world that is established in the novel through either one or more speaking voices. Do we ever see the world of Villette from outside of Lucy Snow's perspective? She's the first person narrator. There is no omniscient narrator that steps in or intrudes upon her narrative. All we have is her first person narrative. The novel is kind of like her memoir or even her autobiography, although she's a character, not a real person, right? So it's written like an autobiography. But are there any points in the novel where that particular vision slips away and another vision comes in? And what are we to make of those moments? If they do indeed exist. Do we see the world ever from outside of Lucy's eyes, as it were? Okay. Anyways, kind of all with me so far. When we think about narrative point of view, we are thinking about the way the novel is mediating the fictional world represented through certain sets of eyes. Do we ever see the world through other characters' eyes? Is a question I'm asking here. Okay, let's just leave this for now. And I'm happy to work a bit further with this, but let's jump back into the novel where we left off on Monday. How does Lucy Snow represent herself? She calls, so the first person narrator as a peace-loving observer, the narrator as silent observer, often in the background. The novel opens with Lucy residing with Mrs. Breton, her godmother, so not with her parents. She's orphaned, right? So she needs to construct herself in a sense. And she lives in a respectable house in Breton. As she writes on page 72, and I'm going to be making numerous pagination references here. Page 72, the charm of variety there was not, nor the excitement of incident. But I liked peace so well and sought stimulus so little that when the latter came, I almost felt it a disturbance and wished rather that it had still held aloof. So here's Lucy representing herself as a peace-loving, someone who longs for a certain kind of isolation or solitude. She represents herself as the ideal observer. She must be about 15 years old when the novel opens. And there are all kinds of hints in the novel about her age. But if she opens her recollections when she's about 15, because she returns home for 8 years. And after Miss Marchmont's death, she notes, and this is on page 107, that she had not yet counted 23 summers. So 15 plus 8 equals 23. So the opening chapters represent her in her mid-teens. That's when life essentially starts for her. There's no information, there's no pertinent information that we're given about her life up until age 15. Okay, so she seems to come into a certain kind of consciousness of herself at that age. That makes sense to me. I think I came into an awareness of myself as a self at around the same age. Although, of course, I could be deluding myself in saying that. But one achieves a certain kind of sense of one's own pseudo-adulthood at about that age. I already asked on Monday what the significance might be of the fact that Lucy doesn't tell us her name until the second chapter. And she also notes on the same page, page 77 in chapter 2, that she is guilty of an overheated and discursive imagination. Anyone want to tell me what a discursive imagination might be? What do you make of that particular curious usage? Discursive, unfolding in discourse, in narrative. She has a discursive imagination. I'll leave that with you. Maybe one of you wants to write a paper on that. An imagination that is prone towards discourse, that is toward representing itself in writing, perhaps. She has a literary imagination. I'm not quite sure. Discursive imagination. I love the phrase. I don't quite know what it means. Okay. So the narrator is the simultaneously engaged and engaged. It's a word I take directly from Charles Taylor. She's engaged and disengaged. She's attached and detached, right, from the world. She calls herself a dispassionate observer, someone who's capable of a certain kind of objective judgment on the world that she looks at. And she's always in search of what she calls the interesting. Is she the novelist in embryo, the novelist looking for material? Okay, and she finds that material in her own life experiences. For example, she comments on young Bretton's and Polly's peculiar, playful relationship as children, noting that Polly is never kindled or gleaming when she's with Mrs. Bretton on page 88. I ceased to watch her under such circumstances. She was not interesting. I ceased to watch her under such circumstances. She was not interesting. She watches the world like we watch TV or YouTube, right? And then on page 94, I was not long allowed the amusement of this study of character. So she's sitting back studying other characters' character. This would make me uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to be under Lucy Snow's deliberate and judgmental gaze. I think there's good reason why other characters are somewhat uncomfortable around her. She's often, and you noted this on Monday, she's often cruel, even callous in her observations of others, especially on first sight. She judges the book by its cover. She's condescending. We discovered this on Monday. She's classist. For example, in her comments on the middle-aged stewardess on the ship Vivid on her way to France, this is what she says about that stewardess on page 116. Hard, loud, vain, and vulgar, her mind and body. She's quite capable of judging other people's looks and bodies, isn't she? She's really mean sometimes. Her mind and body alike seemed brazen and imperishable. I should think from her childhood, she must have lived in public stations, and in her youth might very likely have been a barmaid. Abigail, I see your hand up.
Okay, so she's callous before she gets to France, but I think the callousness really gets beat into her at Villette, because in chapter 9, she's talking about how the students won't respect her if she's kind to them, but they respect her once she's sort of skinned them a little bit. And then once she has sort of had a harsh word with them, then they've started to leave bouquets of flowers on her desk and things like that. So I think that she was callous before, but I think that she became cruel in France, in Villette.
Well, and of course, she's dealing with Catholic girls in France, right? And this is a big, this is an important point. And I'm going to make it in just a few minutes. But I agree with you. And of course, Monsieur Paul himself is a bit of a hard ass, isn't he? Many of the characters with whom she engages in the novel are similarly self-interested, similarly judgmental, and also similarly engaged in the struggle to survive. She is her primary predicament is that she has to make her own way. She's on her own, right? She's without familial support, and she's ultimately successful in that. By the end of the novel, I hope most of you have been able to finish it. And I won't give all the plot away, but she, of course, she establishes her own school. So she becomes her own, with thanks to Monsieur Paul's financial and emotional support. Well, let's think about how we are supposed to read her, how the novel invites us to read her with a certain kind of skepticism, right? Despite the fact that the novel is focalized through her. She is self-representing in the novel, but sometimes her language seems to undermine her own assertions. So there's a kind of ironic distance between who she says she is and how she actually behaves. And so, and focalization, the concept of the novel being focalized through her perspective, enables precisely that seeming contradiction between who she says she is and who she, if I may put it this way, actually is. And she, of course, is actually no one because she's a character in a novel. But the novel invites us to be skeptical of her self-representation, to read her from the outside, even though we are thoroughly immersed in her perspective. Cheyenne.
Just kind of going off of what you're saying, I don't know if you intended on bringing up this example, but on page 279, she sees herself in the mirror and doesn't recognize that it's like her party that she's with until she does recognize it. And so I think it was interesting, like, I guess, structurally of the novel to even put like that in the plot and let us see that side. She doesn't say a whole bunch on it, not as far as I've gotten at least, but yeah, I don't know. I thought that was quite interesting.
That's a wonderful scene when she momentarily fails to recognize herself in the mirror. That's a moment of what Freud calls, and it's the exact example Freud uses in his essay on the uncanny. Those moments in life, and we've all had them, when for a split second you literally see yourself from the outside and fail to recognize yourself. I hope you've all had instances of this where you're walking, maybe in the mall. Yeah, the malls are filled with mirrors, and you glimpse, and for just a split second, you don't realize that's yourself, and then you're taken aback. Oh, that's how others see me, or oh, I see my dad in myself. That's what my aunt meant when she said, "Oh, you look just like your dad." That's what Freud calls the uncanny. It's the return of the repressed, right? This and that jarring sensation that you are not who you think you are. And Freud makes much of those moments as ones in which we can have a certain kind of authentic, if only fleeting view of ourselves as others might see us. It's not totally unlike my looking at my own lectures after I do them on YouTube before I post them. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to see myself that way. I don't want to hear myself that way. It's discombobulating, and that's as far as I'm going to go with that particular confession. But this scene in which she sees herself in the mirror and does not recognize herself is a Freudian moment pre-Freud. And of course, Freud existed before Freud wrote any of his books because his observations are based on all kinds of emerging discourses earlier in the 19th century about the idea of the subliminal, the unconscious. And this novel, I think at points suggests that Lucy Snow is motivated by desires and impulses of which she is not conscious, right? Especially this well, I'm going to talk about it before we finish today, a will towards the Gothic imagination. She wants the world to be like it is in Gothic novels, but that's simply not possible. The world is demystified. There's no such thing as a real ghost, even though for the moment she desperately wants to believe there is a ghost, the ghost of the nun in the attic. But it all turns out to have been nothing, a mannequin, right? So this is a post-Gothic novel in some ways too. I'll get to that in just a few moments. But thank you for pointing us to page 279. It did in fact have that passage highlighted in my novel, but I'm not going to look at it anymore now that we've dealt with that. But there's another passage I want to look at. Page 193, the opening paragraph of chapter 14, the fete, the party. These remarkably disparaging remarks that Lucy makes on the three other teachers that approach her. They're all friendly enough, but each of them falls down in an important way according to Lucy. So I'm just going to read that opening paragraph. It's marvelously, well, there's only one word that I can use. I probably shouldn't use it. It's marvelously bitchy. And this is what I love about Lucy, is her capacity to play that role. Okay, as soon as Georgette was well, Madame sent her away into the country. I was sorry. I loved the child, and her loss made me poorer than before. And then this wonderful phrase, but I must not complain. Okay. All right, Nana, but I must not complain. I lived in a house full of robust life. I might have had companions, and I chose solitude. Each of the teachers in turn made me overtures of special intimacy. I tried them all. And the kind of that instrumental language. She tests each of them and she finds them each one. I tried them all. One I found to be an honest woman, but a narrow thinker, a coarse feeler, and an egotist. The second was a Parisian, externally refined, at heart corrupt, as all Parisians are, right? Without a creed, without a principle, without an affection, having penetrated the outward crust of decorum in this character, you found a slough beneath. That's marvelous language. She had a wonderful passion for presence. And in this point, the third teacher, a person otherwise characterless and insignificant, closely resembled her. This last named had also one other distinctive property, that of avarice. In her reigned the love of money for its own sake. The sight of a piece of gold would bring into her eyes a green glisten singular to witness. She once, as a mark of high favor, took me upstairs and, opening a secret door, showed me a hoard, a mass of coarse, large coin, about 15 guineas and 5-franc pieces. She loved this hoard as a bird loves its eggs. These were her savings. She would come and talk to me about them with an infatuated and persevering dotage, strange to behold in a person not yet 25. Now, of course, those are, as much as those are comments on individuals, they're also comments on Frenchness and on Catholicism, right? These are national shortcomings. These are un-English teachers, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So she's particularly hard on French and Catholic schoolgirls of Villette and the Rue Fossette, with their tendency to falseness, their lack of imagination, their big ears, of course, come in for particular opprobrium. There are constant distinctions being made in the novel between good, honest English girls of the Protestant faith and these more degraded French girls who belong to the Catholic Church. So Englishness, not what it actually means to be English, but the idea of what it means to be English. To be English is to be Protestant primarily, right? With Celtic roots. To be French is to be Catholic, and therefore, obviously, dissimulating, oppressed, incapable of originality, beholden to the church, and its precepts and so on. So whether or not the anti-Catholic sentiment of the novel belongs simply to Lucy, or if it's spilling over from the edges of the author's perspective, is something that we can think about by thinking about how the novel is focalized. How are we supposed to read these passages in which Lucy is so dismissive of other national types, right? How does the novel, or does the novel, in fact, ask us or provide us ways of distancing ourselves from Lucy Snow as the chief focalizer of the novel? She despises the book of pious lectures read at Beck's Academy, and she calls them, and this is on page 183, a wholesome mortification of the intellect, monkish extravagances, and priestcraft. I hope none of those of us who may be Catholic took particular offense at this, but it's really interesting. The Catholic Church, on page 195, the Catholic Church, in capital letters, the Church strove to bring up her children robust in body, feeble in soul, fat, ruddy, hale, joyous, ignorant, unthinking, unquestioning. Okay, so as a background observer in the novel, others reveal themselves to Lucy in ways that they will not reveal themselves to other people. Okay, for example, Polly on page 97, while lavishing her eccentricities regardlessly before me, for whom she professed scarcely the semblance of affection, she never showed my godmother one glimpse of her inner self. So this novel works with the concept of an inner self that can hide itself from external revelation, right? And Lucy's peculiar capacity as a narrator is to dig down into others' selves and see the real them there. So she has a way of penetrating false self-representation and getting to the true inner self. And we know most of those inner selves are rather appalling. So Lucy's personal drama in the novel is between her deep-rooted kind of natural urge on her part towards self-sacrifice and retirement, staying in the background. And so on the one hand, that retirement, staying in the background, and external circumstances that drag her into energetic action. She's constantly going on and on about how she loathes having to put herself out there, right? And we're going to look in good detail next week at the play scene. I know all of you know that the play is very important. She discovers something about herself in the play, that she's as good at acting, at dissimulating as anyone else. But she finds that utterly repulsive. Everyone should be true to themselves, as it were. So inside, outside, action, retirement. This ongoing contradiction in her own character. So she's provocatively contradictory. I think she's at once, for example, hopeful and bold, and on the other hand, fearful and solitary. And I quote from page 121. So peril, loneliness, and uncertain future are not oppressive evils so long as the frame is healthy and the faculties are employed. But then, shortly after this, she regrets her momentary respite on the way to Europe. Page 123. The necessity for exertion more urgent, the peril of destitution's nearer, the conflict for existence more severe. She's pretty uptight. on the whole. So she's tame and still by habit, disciplined by destiny, she says, and she wants to, and this is on page 102, she wants to escape occasional great agonies by submitting to a life of privation and small pains. She's a masochist. But then she also says right after that, but fate would not be so pacified, nor would providence sanction this shrinking sloth and cowardly indolence. What do you want, Lucy? She claims to want one thing, but then she jumps into the other. So she's in this prolonged, what she calls labor for independence, but she's also in search of a place to lay down her burdens. And I quote from late in the novel, page 434, to take up the nobler charge of laboring and living for others. That's the Christian mission, isn't it? Okay. So she's contradictory. There are these tensions between the desire for privacy and the kind of Christian call to action to help others. We are never made privy to the details of her difficult youth, what happens to her before she's 15, to what she calls on page 247, the single-handed conflict with life, with death, with grief, with fate that sets her off on her journey. What happened to her to make her the girl that we see in the opening scenes? Page 108, I'm just going to give a series of quotations that reveal this internal conflict, if I may call it that, internal conflict of the self. I'm going to quote from page 108. I had a staid manner of my own, which ere now had been as good to me as cloak and hood of hodden gray, since under its favor I had been enabled to achieve with impunity and even approbation deeds that, if attempted with an excited and unsettled air, would in some minds have stamped me as a dreamer and a zealot. Is she in fact a dreamer and a zealot and not simply staid? I think she wants us to, she's tempting us to think that. She's not telling us the absolute truth. She claims to be revealing her full self. It's like she's laying on the psychoanalytic couch. This is who I really am. And yet she says, but you could read me this other way as well. It all depends on your perspective, how you look at me, okay? And then later on, page 164, she speaks with regard to Dr. John of, and I quote, that degree of notice and consequence a person of my exterior habitually expects. That is to say, about what is given to unobtrusive articles of furniture, chairs of ordinary joiner's work, and carpets of no striking pattern. That's the closest the novel ever gets to a physical description of Lucy Snow. Do you notice that she's never described? She doesn't even tell us what she sees in the mirror. She's an article of furniture, a chair of shoddy carpenter's work, a carpet without a striking pattern. She's kind of invisible, okay? Page 177, nobody minded me. Page 184, she lives in her own still shadow world. And then finally, on page 186, her inner life is disturbed by thoughts of Dr. John, but she inevitably attains equilibrium. And I quote, complicated, disquieting thoughts broke up the whole repose of my nature. However, that turmoil subsided. Next day, I was again Lucy Snow. In other words, I came to myself once again. But the novel never pinpoints who Lucy Snow actually is. She is this bundle of contradictions. That's what I like about the novel. I mean, that's one of the many things I like about the novel. But Lucy is always in the process of becoming. And there's this marvelous moment in the novel. I'm sure you all noticed this on page 110. Turn to that if you have a moment. Lucy's even capable of self-consciously stepping outside of herself, of what Charles Taylor calls detachment, right? Remember, detachment can function in two ways. The individual detaches himself from the outer world by turning inwards, but also can detach from oneself, step outside oneself to analyze oneself. So she addresses her own character at this point as a distinct being with its foibles and flaws. And I love this particular passage, page 110. For those of you with a different edition, this is right near the end of chapter 5, about 4 paragraphs before the end of chapter 5. Into the hands of common sense, middle of page 110. Into the hands of common sense, I confided the matter. Common sense, however, was as chilled and bewildered as all my other faculties, and it was only under the spur of an inexorable necessity that she spasmodically executed her trust. Thus urged, she paid the porter. Considering the crisis, I did not blame her too much that she was hugely cheated. She asked the waiter for a room. She timorously called for the chambermaid. What is far more, she bore, without being wholly overcome, a highly supercilious style of demeanor from that young lady when she appeared. So this is a moment, and don't worry too much about the scene. This is like when she's freaking out and she gets to France and she's got to find a room and so on. And so she summons her, what she calls her common sense. And she has this internal debate between her timid self and her commonsensical self. So there's this conscious self-detachment in a passage such as this, the fallacy of being able to step outside of oneself. But we all do this. We all have conversations up here. Come on, cinema, just just get to it, just do it, just get it done and then forget about it. We all do this. So these internal conversations. Okay, the final thing I want to say about Lucy today is, and this is a peripheral point, but I know some of you are interested in Gothic fiction, and I do have a few notes for those of you who've never read any of it on what it is, the Gothic romance. I'm going to do a quick screen share here. Don't save. There we go. Okay. The Gothic. Some of you, these are early works of Gothic fiction. Some of you might have read these. The Castle of Otranto, The Mysteries of Udolpho, The Monk, and most famously, perhaps, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Some of you have probably read Frankenstein, or at least you're familiar with the novel through popular conversations and movies. But the Gothic romance emerged in England along with the early realist novel, sort of the mid-decades of the 18th century. So the Gothic is a genre that emerges at about the same time as the novel itself. It's an early form of the English novel. All you really need to know about the Gothic is that it engages with the supernatural world in the here and now in order to chill, thrill, and terrify the reader. It's all about the pleasurable sensations we take in having the shit scared out of us. It's like a roller coaster ride, right? You know ultimately that you're safe, but the thrill is in the imaginative possibility of being injured or killed. Okay, that's what Gothic does. That's the effect that Gothic attempts to have on its readers. The Gothic foregrounds, and so it's a very interesting mode of writing because it foregrounds sexuality, often the dangers of sexuality, the elemental passions, and fear. Fear is the modus operandi of a good work of Gothic fiction, to instill fear in the reader. Gothic fiction tends to be set in distant places and distant times, often in Catholic countries of far Eastern Europe, Transylvania, right? So Gothic is often set and presents visions of a medieval world Gothic cathedrals and Gothic mansions often come in as settings for these novels. Dark passions enacted against the massive and sinister architecture of the Gothic castle or the Gothic cathedral. Evil forces and ghostly apparitions, bleeding helmets, statues falling out of the sky, stuff like that, you know, signs of another world. Settings which consist of castles, monasteries, ruined houses, picturesque surroundings, in other words, settings of decay and dissolution, and characters who tend to be at one extreme or the other. They're either angelically good and innocent. The young virgin is always part of the Gothic because she is threatened by violent and dark sexual predation. This is a chief sort of plot device of Gothic fiction. So the characters are the quintessence of good or evil, and their sanity and chastity are constantly threatened. Irrational and evil forces threaten individual integrity and social order. Okay, so the Gothic is a subgenre of the novel, the Gothic romance that leaves its traces in lots of fiction throughout the 19th century, and it leaves its traces in Villette as well. So my final point is there are moments in the novel where we get these intensely, what I'm going to call them, pseudo-Gothic scenes, okay? Scenes of storm and turbulence, and in which Lucy's feelings are roused and she longs for something bigger, some sign of the supernatural, something bigger and finer, but they're always interrupted by reality. This is, after all, a work of a realist fiction. So the Gothic possibilities are always shut down by reason. What have we just read? Common sense, right? Page 176, Lucy writes this: should not such a mood, so sweet, so tranquil, so unwanted, have been the harbinger of good? Alas, no good came of it. Presently the rude real, capital R, burst coarsely in, all evil, groveling, and repellent as she too often is. So Lucy wants to escape on occasion the confines of the real by indulging in wild, imaginative speculation, but the real always comes back in and intrudes. This is a novel that closes down, as I've said, the possibility of Gothic. So neo-Gothicism. Lucy ultimately returns to the Rue Fawcett and inures itself to its harness. She retreats to the attic to savor Dr. John's letter, and in a state of hypersensitiveness, she sees the rumored ghost of the nun. You might all remember the scene on page 323. Dr. John rescues her and then diagnoses the vision as what he calls a case of spectral illusion, following on and resulting from long continued mental conflict. Lucy is left on page 323, secretly and sadly to wander in my own mind, whether that strange thing was of this world or of a realm beyond the grave. And then she later notes on page 328, doctors are so self-opinionated, so immovable in their dry, materialist views. Okay. At points in the novel, here's my final point, and I do want to look on Monday briefly at that scene in the Rue des Mages, Madame Walraven's decrepit old house, which is just like the Gothic mansion you'd expect to find working Gothic. Lucy exercises what I'm going to call a will to Gothic drama and to melancholy. Page 387, and I'll leave you with this quotation: mine was a soon depressed and easily deranged temperament. It fell if a cloud crossed the sun. So Lucy, as the morbidly sensitive narrator of the novel, who is prone towards these kind of supernatural visions, and then they're always closed down by material reality. So Lucy wants to be something that she can't always be. Once again, my final and big point, I guess, is that she is a wonderfully self-contradictory speaker in this novel. And I think we are asked to be sympathetic with precisely that contradictoriness, because we're all like that. Okay, out of time. I'll be in my office hours on Friday, no regular class. I look forward to talking with any of you there who want to talk with me at any point over the course of that hour. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
I know you mentioned briefly that we could email you about our passages that we use for the